Let's move along then to covered financial institutions. So what we just did was somewhat about covered financial institutions, determining what your runway is based on your origination volume. What's going to make a financial institution covered by this rule year in and year out? And it's a single number, okay? A single number 2 years in a row. You have to have originated greater than or equal to 100 covered business loans each of the prior 2 calendar year ends. So if you ever drop below 100 in the prior year, you're out the next 2. Because the other way to say this is if you originated less than 100 in either of the prior 2 years, you're out for now, until you go over 100 2 years in a row. And we're only going to count originations. Now, this is where things get a little bit tricky. Again, what we were talking about earlier was counting for originations, but relative to the thresholds. We're going to do the same thing here, but we're going to go a little bit deeper because these are those pages that I was saying, make sure you reference them, page 9 and 10, because you don't want to include things that should be excluded. So what are we going to include when we count originations towards this 100 mark or towards the tiered mandatory compliance date mark? So letter C says you're going to count originations of closed-end loans, open-end lines, credit cards, and merchant cash services. So some of you listening are HMDA reporters, right? And so this sounds a lot like HMDA. It's kind of, but a lot different too. This doesn't matter what the collateral is. Now, we're going to get into some exclusions, and there's some collateral-based exclusions that I'll explain in a little bit. But the general rule is you're going to include any origination relative to these products towards your threshold, whether it's coverage or whether it's your mandatory compliance date that we talked about earlier. Note at the very bottom of that list on page number 9, there's an asterisk. It says, see, do not report section. That's page 18 and 19. So you need to make sure that when you're doing this counting, that you look ahead to the exclusions and don't include any of those. Okay, so that's a section that will come up a little bit later. So rather than be redundant and include it twice, we're just say, hey, go look at that section. Don't include those when you're counting your originations. You're also not going to include anything that is an existing loan or line where you do a modification to it, okay, even if there is new money. Now, here's where things get tricky. When we're deciding what to include and exclude for counting originations, you're never going to count modifications. However, when we get to reporting later, you do count it if it's new money. And that's just the way they rolled it. Okay, so for counting originations, no modifications. For reporting, you will report some modifications, okay, which will be a little different. I'll get more on that a little bit later here too. The other thing I probably should have mentioned in C1 is make sure you're including refinances, where you tear up loan A, replace it with loan B, regardless of the loan number, regardless of what you call it. If you tear up one loan, replace it with another, that's a reportable transaction, assuming it doesn't meet one of the exclusions.